two large components. The first one being a component called carbon, and the carbon daemon basically is responsible for receiving your metrics, right? So it's running on a TCP port or a UDP port, and applications from everywhere just push your metrics into the carbon daemon, and carbon daemon can then persist the data onto the file system, and then you have multiple options for writing to the file system. You could be using RRDs, you could be using something called as Whisper, which is a modified version of RRD that's part of Graphite, and there's something else called series, which is yet another version of the same thing. The other part basically is Graphite Web, which is really the web application that lets you browse metrics, it prints graphs as PNGs, it gives you data back as JSON, raw format, what have you. Carbon daemon is basically written on top of Twisted, and Graphite Web is written on top of Django, right? Specifically, the thing that we've been mucking around with here is to try and push the throughput of Carbon and Graphite. What we're hoping to do is to get at least 250,000 metrics pushed through the system every minute. That's sort of the target that we are looking at. As to why we have that many metrics, a lot of it is actually business metrics I'm looking at, not tech metrics like CPU uptime or downtime. We just realized that the whole thing of there are always a whole bunch of cool graphs that are cool on the business side, like which country is your traffic coming from, from which device is your traffic coming from. Just plotting all of those numbers with some amount of slicing and dicing at real time is kind of fun. Graphite seemed like a good way to do it. In theory, it's possible to push it to about 3 million data CDs a minute. Someone in the Graphite community said, they've done that in theory, except that our experiences show that it requires a lot of brain even for Graphite to hold up at 50,000 points per minute, right? That's been our experience so far. Part of the trouble I've seen is even getting the basic setup running Graphite is hard. It's hard because people haven't updated the dependencies on, let's say, Django. The dependency in Django is like 1.3. It's only 1.3c, it's like 1.3, so even the security fixes have not been updated in the requirements.txt. It's the same on the Carbon side, so there is part of that being a pain. The other is just the setup.py has been written with assumptions that you're going to install it on your base OS and not inside a virtual ENV. That causes another set of all sorts of pain. It assumes that /opt Graphite is the base directory in which all installs are going to happen, and if you choose to violate that, yes, there are options in theory, except it gets incredibly painful fairly quickly. Then there are issues around just stability of the Carbon daemon, because the backends where it has Whisper or series is really inefficient in the way it uses the file system, because if, let's say, talking of 250,000 metrics, right? So each metric is actually held inside a directory on the file system, and potentially files inside that. So if you're basically pumping that much of metrics, it's just spending a lot of time stacking the file system, opening files and closing files for just updating one numerical value. So that isn't working out either. Series is supposed to be the experimental back end that makes things better, except that it seems to be making things worse, and that it's losing data every now and then. But again, all of this is experience which is live. We've been doing these updates. The last update internally that we pushed was last night. I woke up this morning to realize it's not working. What you can expect from us in a few months' time is obviously a blog post to say, here's how you actually run it in a way that doesn't trip over itself. And there's a good chance we might end up writing our own storage layer because it's inefficient, and when we do write that, it's going to be out there in the point in time. And really that's it, right? It's like, it's a nice tool, everything is Python, everything is things that we understand. It's just that it isn't scaling up. And it's kind of ironical that a tool that was built for monitoring application performance itself is not scaling up. So we're hoping to do something about it. Any questions on specifics of how you're using it, or you have suggestions, feel free to say that.
So what kind of storage you are planning to use?
What kind of storage you're planning to use? So here is basically the question that we need to get over, right? We can put in essentially a network storage server, right? It can be any key value pair. Then what happens is that you've converted all of the file system calls very nicely into network I/O calls, okay? And at some level that doesn't make me happy, right? We're really hoping that if it is some sort of an embedded database, by embedded I mean you're not doing any sort of RPC, that will be a good thing, okay? Again, the reason is that all of the existing Graphite implementations also are using what is an embedded solution, in that it's not accessible over the network unless you go through the Carbon daemon. So there is some merit in not breaking away from that pattern. So we're looking at, I don't know, maybe things like an embedded version of something like Tokyo Cabinet, or if level DB bindings work nicely as an embedded module, something like that, on those lines. And anything that doesn't require, so the two big criteria is you shouldn't be doing increased file system calls in terms of just opening and closing as the number of metrics go up. You know, you can say MongoDB, but eventually how do you model there matters. So one thing is whatever solution we pick, open file handles and file operations remain fixed for time series management. The second thing is try and again minimize RPC. So with that, we'll probably be looking into a few options. The other interesting thing about Graphite that I realized is the web application, right, can operate in two modes. It can either read the local file system directly, pick the data, read for itself, or it can essentially delegate all of the read operations to the Carbon daemon and say that the web app will directly not touch the file system. So what that gives you is a great option of inventing newer backends, adding support for that in the Carbon daemon, not adding support for that in the Graphite web layer, and just say Graphite web delegates everything down to Carbon, right? So that's probably the model we're going to follow. Anything else?
Okay. What was the motivation behind choosing Graphite and Central? Because you probably have gone to other tools like Unity.
So Graphite is different from everything else in that it has very beautiful APIs when you're pulling data out of it, right? If you look at the Graphite website of it, you can take multiple time series and do things like you want to do an integral of the time series, you want to do a difference of two time series, or you want to say, write an expression that qualifies across 100 time series. Just to give you an idea, even on, let's say, traditional monitoring perspective, let's say you have 200 servers and you're monitoring CPU. Either you can have a graph that shows you 200 lines, or you can say, with Graphite, plot metrics only for 10 machines out of the 200 and select the 10 in such a way that their maximal value is actually on the higher side. Okay, so you could have like 90 hosts chugging along nicely, only 10 of them are deviating beyond something, and you can actually pass all of it as an expression at the time of generating graphs. So if you're looking at Graphite as a graphic solution in itself, you can start constructing these things. Very simple things like, let's say you're passing in an incremental counter. This happens all the time, right? The number of requests handled by a web server is usually a counter. You expose it. In RRD speak, it's a counter, it's not a gauge, right? And then you actually, what you need is not a line that goes up like this, okay? Which says request at this cumulative request at minute X plus 1. what you need is something that gives you requests per minute. You can go to Graphite and say, take this time series, do a non-negative derivative. Okay, you can do a derivative actually give you requests per minute. The non-negative comes because when you restart your server, the counter wraps over and goes down to 0, at which point the derivative basically goes the other way. You have an expression like non-negative derivative which understands that and gives you that normalized view, right? That's one part of it. The expression language on top of the time series is incredibly powerful. The second thing is that there is a lot of community-based web front ends, visualization front ends built on top of this Graphite API. Okay, so if you don't like the default dashboards that Graphite produces, you can take in something like a Teso, or you can take in something like Cubism from Square. Actually, there's a huge list. You can take in all of those libraries, which are pure JavaScript libraries, and say, here is where my Graphite web is. At which point your Graphite web server is getting used merely as a JSON data provider, not as a visualization front ends. And then you can have a completely different set of alternate tools built on top of it. So that's sort of the reason why Graphite looks attractive. That's on the website. On the producer side, equally you will find libraries that are willing to push things out in the Carbon protocol, right? So at the on the Carbon side, you find a lot of application libraries that are standardized. At the out, you have the API itself that's powerful, and then tools that are built on top of that API because it's powerful. So at the edges, right, it looks very compelling. You know, deep within, the guts of Graphite is the place where it doesn't look attractive enough for us, and we said, we can fix that, that's an easy problem.